My name is Subbu Bhaskaran. I am the product manager for Sencha Test, and this is Joel Watson. He's the lead engineer for the Sencha Test. We're very happy to have you guys here. Hope you guys had lunch. So this is the first breakout session for the and the test track. This is the first time we have a separate track for test. And it's going to be a year since we started developing Sencha Test, and we have gone through lots of revisions, reviews, and re-architecture to make this product a good comprehensive tool for a lot of different personas, not just developers, but for QA engineers and everybody. So when we first started to build a test product, the idea was to provide developers with a good viable option to write unit testing and functional tests. So even before we started building Sencha Test, before I joined Sencha, the XJS framework team has been using a combination of Jasmine and WebDriver with the in-house inbuilt test runner to test the framework and all of its different components. And you guys have all used XJS, so you guys know how many components are there, and every component for multiple versions of the framework have to be tested on multiple browsers. And so our engineering team put together this humongous test framework with close to 8,000 to 9,000 test cases that run on multiple browsers simultaneously. That makes up close to 30,000 test cases on a weekly basis on multiple versions of framework. So when we did that, so they thought this could be a great opportunity to provide the same value to our customers, so you guys can do the same thing with this product. So keeping that in mind, when the first 1.0 was rolled out, it was for developers to be able to test early, to be able to write adopt a test-driven development methodology where you can write your test code first and write your app code in parallel and do your testing and coding together. We did inbuilt code coverage capabilities. We did browser farm integrations. We provided a way to test individual components. But why did we do that? The reason was testing on the web is very difficult even today, because once you build an application, deploy it to a server, everything gets very dynamic, and the QA teams are struggling. So everybody who tries to automate testing at some point are resorting back to manual testing, or they are working really hard to maintain a test framework that they have put together for their team. So that is why we wanted to push the baton more early, so people can start testing much earlier in the phase. And to do that, you need a lot of tools to actually accomplish that unit testing. So when you look at it, of course you can take a plain vanilla Jasmine 2.0. You can write your own runner. You can do all kinds of cool stuff. But given the time constraint and the effort involved in creating that and maintaining that, and if you are moving on to a different project, why do you have to go through all that effort to download and maintain and do all kinds of stuff? And that is the reason we integrated all these things under one platform. Now, for test engineers who are doing functional testing, who wants to write automated tests, we created Sencha Test with that also in mind. But what we did was, in the 1.x version, it was mainly, and it was only focused on single page applications. And when we rolled out the product, we got some very good feedbacks and we got some very bad feedbacks as well. But with the negative feedback, what we found out was the product was not usable with enterprise applications because of the authentication problems. A lot of customers that we talked to came back to us and asked us, how can we circumvent the login issue? The page is getting redirected, but behind that firewall, behind that login, it's a single page app. Why can't I test it? So we initially thought we would create a solution to fix that problem, but then we took a different approach altogether, which I'll be talking to you guys about in a minute. But before going into all that, this is a very famous story about organizations and strategy formation. But I thought this is also applicable to, testing in general. How many of you guys know the story, the elephant? Yeah, it's a great story, right? So when blind men were asked about how does an elephant look like, so each one of them caught hold of one of the parts of elephant's bodies and they just started feeling it out, and they said, okay, it feels like a rope, it feels like a cave. But nobody knew the entire picture of the elephant because they could not see the elephant as a whole. That is precisely the problem with testing as well. When people start testing, they think that automated testing is a headache, is a nightmare. But it's not, because once you have the right tools in place, once you have the right methodologies and design principles in place, if you consider a test automation project as critical as building the actual application itself, then you will have a one-time effort to create those things, and then ongoing maintenance would be easy. I'm not saying that there is no maintenance effort, but if you have to go through that process initially and step back, take a look at the bigger picture and see what are the upfront costs versus what you're going to save in terms of money, in terms of time, the kind of quality code that you're going to be generating in the future. So this is a main principle that we are trying to drive here from Sencha, is that testing early and looking at the bigger picture and testing together as a team, developers and QA and everybody together, I think that would be a great way to start an automation project. And by involving all the stakeholders in the company, you are getting a better buy-in, so you have the time to and resources to put in upfront to create the automation strategy. And now shift testing left. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time because we have a demo and Joel would be talking through this. So with Sencha Studio, with Sencha Test, you can actually test every single component, every single class that you're writing. You can separate it out, you can test it however the way you want. And we have created the product in such a way that you can organize everything under scenarios, and the scenarios can be based on features or functionalities or pages. It is up to your creativity how well you want to define a scenario. By neatly organizing them, you can put them and store them in your CI servers, and you can run them on multiple browsers simultaneously. That is the main benefit of using Sencha Test for unit testing. Now, with the IDEs, a lot of people use IDEs for development and editors for development. So using another tool like Sencha Studio could be a pain. So we have provided a command line interface that can be used for running tests on a command line and invoking browsers on either locally or remotely. So in that way, you don't have to necessarily use Studio. We had a training by Max yesterday where we covered all these things, but this is this is the main goal for Sencha Test for developers, is to be able to write unit tests as soon as you start developing a new application. Now, when we go into functional testing, the problem is when your QA team, or even when you as a developer wants to test the production build, there's no access to code. It's completely black box. You don't know what's happening under the hood. So you pretty much have to rely on what you're seeing. So in order to be able to test that, you can't rely on manual testing because it gets cumbersome, it gets longer. You have to have some kind of solution to be able to do that testing. And even with functional testing, it has to be tested on multiple browsers, because at that point, UAT, user acceptance testing, gets involved, the business owners get involved, and when you are saying that an app has been tested and it's ready to go to production, and if one of your business stakeholders takes a look at an app and finds a problem, that's a bigger problem to fix, rather than QA putting in the time and effort to creating automated scripts and then running it on multiple browsers. So I have an interesting story to share. So I was working for a company where we were selling automation services before, and this is with one of their largest retailers in the world, and they had their marketing team had a website that was hosted not only for the North American region, it was hosted for all of the entire world. So they had multiple languages and all kinds of cool things. But when their CTO tried to order a product, and he actually knew that the product was there in the inventory, but the product actually got waitlisted for him. So he got so mad, he called people and he tried to talk to all the technical people, and they found out that the web application that the marketing team was using did not have good communication with the servers, and since there were two different teams that were handling that, they were not able to effectively communicate about the testing requirements. So then we found out that there was just one person doing the testing for QA, who's actually a marketing person, and it's not even a technical person that was doing the QA for the marketing website. So all the promo codes, all the discounts that we see on our emails had to be tested very thoroughly for the marketing website to function properly. So that's when they called in us, and then we went and did some work, and it turned out that they needed at least 10 people to do manual testing on multiple websites. And since we were an offshore company, they actually hired us to do that, but then we went and automated that for them because that's an easy process. So testing can, at that stage when an app is deployed, especially web application that can be updated without even the users downloading it, it is very efficient that we keep testing at all stages, and automated testing is absolutely crucial. What are the major issues faced, or when do you start automated testing? When do you consider your application stable? This is a very crucial thing to think about, because whenever we talk to customers about their applications, they either say that it's too mature, we don't want to go back and start working on it, or if they are building something new, they are like, oh, it's very unstable, we can't start testing it right now. So there's no right or wrong time. It's all about just planning together as a team and saying that, okay, we have these features developed, now let's think about how to automate them. And that automation process has to start when the developers actually start thinking about the features. In that way, you can easily work together and maybe even have hooks in your applications for the automation testers, because not every element or every form can be easily identified using automation tools. There are always some quirks that would make the automated tests fail. So by having this process started much earlier, like with the developers and QA together, I think you can address the issue of the instability and also identifying locators. That is one of the biggest problems. So we have a great tool called Sencha Inspector. If you're a premium customer, you probably have used Sencha Inspector. That helps you with identifying all the locators in the web application that you're building. And within Sencha Test, we have the event recorder that will help you locate these items. But if you have a good design principle and if you have follow the best practices of automated testing and involve QA much ahead in the cycle, you can take care of the locator problems as well. Now, another big problem is the browsers getting updated, browser drivers getting updated, the Selenium servers that you're using, that's getting updated. So how do you keep track of all these things? Your job is to build great apps and serve your customers. So this has to be taken care of by somebody else. And relying on open source technologies is great. If you have the time and resources, awesome, anybody can do anything. But with the given time constraints, if this can be taken care of by somebody else, then it's better let it be taken care of by somebody else. So you don't have to worry about which Selenium server to use or which browser driver to use. You shouldn't be thinking about all that, because those are all cosmetic things that are needed for running test automation. And finally, CI. CI is a very crucial thing, especially for web applications. Continuous integration and deployment has to be there for every company for them to function very efficiently. So when you think about test automation, it should be in your source control. It should be deployed automatically. It should be run nightly, weekly, daily. So all these things have to be taken care of before even you're actually putting pen to paper to write an automation script. So coming to continuous integration, what we have found is, and there's actually a great talk by our partners from Sauce Labs. So this guy, he created this automation framework for Yahoo, and he'll be talking about that, about testing every pull request and testing in a continuous integration and deployment cycle. But to me, this is the most critical item for test automation, and we have taken every care to address this problem. And one of our engineers, Marcelo, he's going to be doing a session where he'll be talking about continuous integration using Sencha Test. So the main idea here is once you create all your tests, you should be able to simply invoke a command line task from one of your whichever CI systems that you're using, and connect all the put your Sencha tests in there, either from a source control or just place them there, and things should start running. That's all there is to a CI integration for test automation. And this has to be set for every environment that you're using, be it a dev environment, a QA environment, or production, staging. It has to be set up for all these environments, so the same test can run on multiple environments simultaneously, so you don't waste time. So you know the differences between each environment, so you can keep correcting them to get to an ideal state. And leveraging browser forms can actually tackle most of the infrastructure hassles that you have, because browser forms helps you with any browser version, any on any platform, and you don't have to worry about having a WebDriver server running or Selenium server running, or you don't have to worry about downloading browser drivers on each of your VMs. So by using browser forms, you are able to just create your tests, put them in your CI system, and run them somewhere, and then get the results back in your server. So in that way, you do spend some money in running the tests on a remote browser form, your firewall issues and all those things permitting, but that takes away a lot of maintenance cost and maintenance effort for you guys. So based on what the problems that our customers faced, and giving a holistic solution, so in Sencha Test 2.0, we have integrated WebDriver IO. And WebDriver IO is a product that was born out of one of the engineers from Sauce Labs. So Sauce Labs is a browser form company founded by the founders of Selenium, and so they have come out with WebDriver IO, which is actually a great technology that we have integrated so that you can test your multi-page apps using Sencha Test. Now, what we have also provided a way to not just create tests, but execute them on multiple browsers, and also debug your tests that you have written using the embedded browser. And we have actually embedded an actual Chrome browser with the product. So when you open Sencha Test 2.0 and create a WebDriver scenario, you will have an embedded Selenium server and a Chrome browser, so you can do event recording, and you can even use our Sencha Test APIs to start writing tests and run on the embedded browser. What that means is you don't have to download anything external, you don't have to download a Selenium jar file, or you don't have to download a browser driver. I know it's not a big problem, downloading them are simple enough, but if you want to replicate the same thing on multiple environments, you don't want to keep doing them all over again. And if browser driver updates, then you have to go and update them, because they don't automatically update. So, but by using Sencha Test with the embedded browser and server, you will be easily able to create tests and run them directly from there. So this EA, again, the event recorder has been enhanced for using with WebDriver and the embedded browser. You can do multi-page application testing. The Futures API will work with WebDriver. So what it means is, if you'd been in the training yesterday, you would have noticed that if you use a Futures API, you don't have to do explicit wait times, and the st.apis know to wait for XJS application to be completely rendered, so it can start performing all the actions. So that is an amazing feature, and we will be developing more of those API methods for you guys to use, so you don't have to create workarounds to access an element or access a button or a grid. Everything will be provided through that API list, so you will be able to just start writing your tests. So that is the goal. At the end of the day, I keep coming back to that, is because all you should be able to do is just open the product and write tests. There should be nothing more or less to it. And visual screen comparison is another great capability that we had in 1.x, and we have extended it to be used with WebDriver. So if QA teams can use that for smoke testing, when you deploy on a new server, new environment, you can just run those screenshot tests to make sure that the images that you're getting on the new environment matches to the images that you had from your previous build. So, yeah.
All right, thanks, Subbu. Man, it's great to see everyone here. When we saw that we got slated next to Dawn, we were like, oh, everyone's gonna go to Dawn's cool new thing, but it's awesome to see everyone here. Thanks very much for coming. All right, so as Subbu mentioned in his presentation, our big goal of Sencha Test 2.0 is to really target and zero in on the different personas or the different types of people who need to do testing. So whether it be a developer like myself, who needs to do like really hardcore unit testing, or whether it be a QA engineer who is really interested in like testing the final product that's going to be released next Friday. Both of those scenarios are obviously very relevant within the domain of testing. So we wanted to make sure to kind of highlight the things that Sencha Test can bring to help you basically execute both of those goals. So the first I want to talk about is the unit testing side of things. So that's it's going to be my favorite meme of all time. I know it's old and used up, but it's just perfect. So why unit testing? First of all, how many of you do unit testing of any kind? Okay, pretty much everyone. How about unit testing of JavaScript? Okay, the number of hands significantly shrunk there. So you've all heard the arguments in favor of unit testing. It helps to reduce new bugs, hopefully, defend against regressions, make refactoring easy, again, helping with the bugs and regressions. Sometimes there's this notion about satisfying institutional goals for code coverage, right? You get a mandate from on high that says you have to have tests that cover this amount of code. So those are kind of the usual arguments. And they're good arguments, but they're not the best because there's ways to work around all of these, right? If you're a clever developer, you can easily write lots of code coverage tests that pass perfectly, but doesn't actually help your application. So that's the usual arguments. What are some of the better reasons? Well, developing tests, if you're going to develop them through your application, if you're going to sink this amount of time and energy, because it does take time and energy to write good tests, one of the really good outcomes of that is that it demonstrates that you know what your code is doing, right? So if you can test your code, you have to know what it's doing. I mean, if you're just writing tests to get green, to make the red go away, that's fine, and it's a test. But actually developing a test that executes the code that you're trying to test and demonstrates that code is doing what it should do, it shows everyone, including the other developers who are ready to blame you for everything that happens, for breaking the build. It demonstrates to everyone and to yourself that you know what this code is doing. So that's a great side effect of unit testing. Another one is it gives you really good confidence, less fear about releases. I used to work with a guy who worked in an office where they had an automatic build server, and every time the build got broken and the tests failed, like they had something hooked into it where it would blare this audio thing throughout the office that said, Kevin broke the build, Kevin broke the build. That's no fun to be in that position. You never want to be the one on the end of the blame, but if you have good unit tests in your code, that'll help to mitigate that fear. Easily automatable. Subbu already talked about that. There's lots of great solutions out there for automatically testing and running these tests, on distributed environments. The one I like the best is that testing forces you to implement better design in your code. How many of you have ever written a God function? You know what that means? Like you have this one function in your controller that does like 12 things, or 12 times 10 things, or 12 times n things, right? Those are the worst, but they're also the best because they do all the stuff and it's great. But when you actually go to test that thing, you're like, oh, I can't test this. I can test that it passes maybe, but all these individual things that happen inside of this God function are really difficult to test if that's the only place that they happen. So by unit testing, it really forces you to rethink how you develop those kinds of things. So God functions go away and you start developing much more modular and granular code that can be tested, that will be tested, that you're going to do a great job of testing, right? Right, excellent. So ultimately, testing equals a better you. All right. And so some of the benefits of unit testing in Sencha Test, you can easily connect to and write your tests for both applications, code packages, even custom extensions. You can test your code without ever launching your full ext.js application. So again, unit testing, we want to test those very small pieces of code. Sencha Test allows you to really target those without having to go through the full-on application launch, navigation, do all these different things. You can target the things that you want to test. And of course, it comes with a built-in code editor, so you can easily author your tests directly within Sencha Test. If you're wanting to run those tests immediately within Sencha Test while you're writing them, it's really handy to have all of that right there. So now I'm looking at everyone's faces and they're like, just stop talking and show some demos. Okay, I will. All right, so one of the first things I wanted to show you is Subu mentioned that we have the idea now of multiple kinds, or two different kinds of scenarios. So we have, first of all, kind of the developer-oriented scenario. This is a scenario that's going to be, and only can be, executed within the browser. That's kind of demarcated by this little browser/globe icon. I don't know how well you can see that on the screen. This is kind of the Sencha Test 1.0 approach. We kept all of that goodness there, so it still works the way that it did. But in this, it's important to understand when you're running these tests, it's going to be running everything in the browser. So the tests that you write, all of the code, it's going to be there executing in the browser. So you can't go across pages. Sad emoji. The second kind of scenario that we have is running with WebDriver scenario. This is the new sexy goodness that Subu talked about, where we can actually enable multi-page application testing. And this works for regular run-of-the-mill JavaScript applications or even your ext.js applications. So the first one that I want to talk about is the unit tests. This is going to be our kind of in-browser unit testing. And I'm just going to show you a couple examples, and as a caveat, the examples that I'm showing you are just fly-by-night. I'm just trying to give you a taste of what's going on. I'm not trying to suggest any kind of best practice in the actual tests that you see, because there's lots of different ways to write these tests. But one of the examples I wanted to highlight is just the really generic concept of testing a model, right? So everyone uses models in their applications, I assume. How many of you just make models kind of by letting ext.js make them fields in the store config? Or does everyone like do actual classes? I think I'm cutting out a little bit here.
Whenever you wave your hand.
Oh, I'll stop waving. Okay. So one of the things I think gets overlooked a lot, and I did this a lot when I was doing ext.js development day by day, is I would often kind of neglect the model because I had controllers and I can do lots of things in controllers. But the model can be a really, really powerful place to do a lot of different things. You can, obviously you can define all the fields that you want to use, but, and hopefully you guys are all doing this, you can actually, create your own methods on that model that will, in a self-contained way, help you manage the state of that model. And so that's kind of one of the examples that I wanted to show. So I have a very simple email model from my admin application, kind of the one from the Sencha examples. I have a couple different users that are going to form an association, and then I just have a couple fields on this that I want to edit. So the main thing I want to show you is that, so how many of you use associations? Okay, cool. Associations are super simple to test. You just create your model, add your associated entities, and you can start testing. So I'm going to show that real quick. And this test we're doing simple unit testing, so with a model, we don't care about the UI. So browser's going to launch, but I don't care about seeing it. We just want to run some tests. So I have this associations suite created here, and I just want to make sure that I have a specific class as the sender, and I want to also make sure that I get a store back when I retrieve that association. So let's go ahead and just run this and make sure it works. Well, it was super fast and it all worked, so that's happy. Never know with the demos. But all we're doing, you can see here, it's very simple. We have created an email person, or an email, and we're calling getSender on it, and we want to make sure that this sender is of a specific class. And then finally, we have another method here where we want to make sure that a store is returned when we call the CC field. So we have an email, and we're just calling CC to retrieve the associations, and we're making sure that the count is equal to what we expect. And we also want to make sure that the people who are in that for our test match the people that we expect them to do. So very simple. We also have, I have several more tests in here, and I can make this code available to all of you. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but the last one I wanted to show you that kind of gets back to that using the model as kind of a driver for its own data is this custom model methods. So when I was developing ext.js applications, I would usually, a lot of times, maybe not usually, but I would create that God function. And let's say maybe I have an on item click for a grid. So I have my email grid. Actually, I'll show you what that would look like. Well, actually, I'll come back to that. Sorry. Let's just say I have an email grid that shows all my emails, and when I click on that, I want to read the email and then mark that email as read, so that it'll stop being bold or whatever the UI does. So in the past, what I would have done is just in my controller, hey, on item click would be my handler, and I would just do a bunch of stuff inside that method, right? Well, it works, it does what you want it to do, but again, you can't test it. So what we're going to do instead is actually change our email model up so that we can actually have methods on that model and do the things that we want to do. So for example, I have my email model here, has all my fields defined and just very simple methods on it. And so in my test, I can actually just test those methods on the model itself instead of having to spin up my entire application, go to the grid, simulate a click. All that stuff is completely unnecessary to actually test what I want to test with this model, which is to make sure that when I set red, that it'll be true, or when I set favorite, it'll be true or false or whatever it might be. So we'll go ahead and check those tests out, make sure that they run as we expect them to. Hooray, green again. Green's my favorite color in test. All right, so again, I'm just trying to show some very simple examples of what you can do to kind of test the simple things or the common things within everyone's applications. And so the next example would be a view. And let's just see this really quickly. So with a view, we have this email composition form that pops up when you click on this compose button within our application. And so there's certain things within that form that we would like to test. And this is kind of bordering on blurring the line a little bit between unit test versus integration test versus functional test. But since it lives within the unit test bucket, I'm going to call it a unit test. So in this example, what we want to test is a few things. We want to make sure that A, this form should not be submittable if the form is invalid. B, we want to allow submission when it is valid, and then finally it should close the form when it's submitted. So in the interest of time, I'm going to run all three of these at the same time. I do have some, that's not the right one. I'll show you the tests real quick. So what I'm doing is I'm just spinning up an instance of my email compose component. I'm using the Futures API, which we'll talk about just a little bit later, to kind of get some references that I can use later on within my tests. And again, this is happening within a before each. If you've done Jasmine testing of any kind, you're familiar with the syntax. And then I just have some very simple expectations within my, or some very simple methods within my tests here that will help to validate that the things I'm looking for are true. And one thing you'll notice, I have a bunch of weights listed in here. If you've done unit testing before, you might understand weight to indicate that you're kind of hacking around things to make sure things show up when you want them to. The only reason these weights are here is so that you can see what's happening in the browser. I would normally get rid of these because the Futures API, as we'll talk about in just a second, is going to completely take care of the weighting for you. So let's give this a run. Hopefully I can switch over fast enough to see everything here. Okay, so it's filling out my form. You can see the send button is disabled. Now everything, well, it ran really fast, even with my weights. So sorry about that. I can show it to you after the session in more detail if you're interested. But again, we got all green, everything's passing. And we, again, the unit tests are simple, but they're showing that we know what our application is doing. We know what these individual pieces of our app are supposed to do, and we're testing that they're doing exactly that. So these qualify as pretty decent unit tests. All right. Sorry, back to talking. Functional testing. So again, we have an entire part of Sencha Test 2.0 has been dedicated to helping test engineers and QA engineers really be able to do a lot more with Sencha Test than they were able to do with Test.10. So the challenges with functional testing are things like happy path versus reality. So as a developer, you develop your application, you test it out, probably in Chrome, maybe that's it. And then you throw it up on the server and you're like, hey, test this out. And then the user comes back and they're like, this doesn't work at all. And you're like, it worked for me on my machine, right? That's one of the things that happens a lot. We also have the wonderful opportunity for cross-browser distinctiveness, right? Just the world of possibilities there to make it happy and friendly for everybody. And then just the reality, testing full applications, especially JavaScript applications, is just plain hard. You can do unit testing as much as you want, but eventually all those components and pieces that you've been testing have to fit together somehow to make an application that works. And it's that part, that final coming together of things, that can be extremely hard to ultimately test. And so, there's lots of asynchronicity involved with all of this. Are things visible? Is this thing here yet? Do I have the data I need? And of course, it's difficult to mock. It's really hard in a local environment to get all of the pieces together that will kind of represent the actual application. So at some point, we have to do functional testing. We have to make sure that the things that we expect to happen in the actual application are happening. So that's one of the things that we have done with Sencha Test 2.0 is to really bring a lot of things to the table to help with that. So as Subu already mentioned, we can leverage WebDriver now to do both single page and multi-page testing, so that's pretty awesome. We have completely revamped the Futures API to not only do what they were doing before, but also bring some extra goodies to the table to help simplify the testing of the asynchronous actions that you find in your real-world applications. And then finally, you can execute your browsers across execute the tests across the browsers that you want to ensure that everything is going the way you expect. So I'm going to do some very, very quick functional testing demos because I do want to save some time for QA. Here we go. Okay, so I have, I'm going to show you a login test example. This is one of the areas that we found feedback was, or one of the areas we got the most feedback about from Sencha Test 1.0 is that to be able to support this kind of login testing so we can log in and then go to another page and still be able to execute tests within that workflow. And so the login test that I have, I'll show you real quick what that looks like. And unfortunately, I'm running out of time, so I won't go into too much detail, but one of the paradigms I'm using in this particular example is the idea of a page object. Has anyone used that before, like in Selenium testing or elsewhere? Okay, I see a couple hands out there. Basically what we're able to do, and I'll just show you what this looks like really fast. I have this just JavaScript file, it's just an object that defines a couple of methods. You can see all it's doing is just returning a couple calls to the Features API. All I've done on my scenario is just say, hey, I want you to import this thing with you when you start testing, when you run this test. And so now when I actually execute my test, I can leverage that object within my test to kind of, it's not only for reusability, but it's also for kind of maintainability, because you can not have to muddy your test with a lot of extra stuff. You can just import it one time across all your scenarios if you want to, across your entire project if you want to, and then just start executing these methods right off the bat. So very simple test. But all we're doing here is you're going to see a login form. We're going to type into the username. We're going to type into the password, and we're going to submit that form. And the first one we know is going to fail because we're giving it a bad username and password. And all we're doing here is expecting that this errors message thing is going to show up, and that it's going to have this particular content. And the second one, we're going to give it a good username and a good password. We're going to submit the form, and then it's going to go on to another page. And all we're going to do, just to verify that everything's working as we expect it, is to make sure that this logo on the next page is visible. So let me run these tests real quick and kind of show you what this looks like. Okay, there's my first test. Sorry, it ran a little fast. Okay, super fast. So Sencha Test runs tests pretty quick. But again, I think you hopefully saw the execution chain. It did our failed login. It checked the thing, and it returned green because everything's green. And the second one, it logged in successfully and was able to navigate to the next page. Again, cross-page navigation, because the login page was just login.html. The next page was index.html, so it's legitimately a multi-page navigation. And in test 1.0, that would not have worked. Your first half of the test would have been fine, and then it would have lost communication. But with the WebDriver integration that we have now, you can do these multi-page tests with ease, and it just works. And you can see in my actual tests, I didn't have to. This is going across pages, and I didn't have to do anything. I didn't have to tell it to go. It's just going along with the flow of the application. So I have another suite of tests I could show. I'll leave it for after the session if you guys want to come up and take a look at those. I do want to open it up for Q&A so that we leave time for that, because hopefully there's some good stuff there. So any questions from anyone? Yeah, go ahead.
Can the unit test be defined and run in a command line? Do you have to define your unit test through that UI application?
Yeah, you can structure it you can define the suite within any UI that you want, and then using STC you can run that suite from the command line. Sure.
So like a .js file, like something like a Jasmine test or whatnot. As long as it's like a plain text JavaScript file, you can just point Sencha command to it, and you can run it in the command line and get the result.
Yeah, STC. Yeah, for sure.
It still has to be run through a browser, though. Each browser has a different JavaScript engine, so.
That's true. You would have to, right. And as part of the STC running, you do have to set up a browser farm. But that could be whichever browsers you chose.
But you could do that through some sort of like a DOM emulator like Phantom.
Sure.
Right? Okay. So you wouldn't necessarily, so it could be like a headless DOM environment.
Yeah. I saw another hand back behind. Yeah.
Is there any config parameter that will manage if you want to run a test in the browser or use a private browser? Like you showed that there is icon, how to switch between.
That's a great question. I can show that real quick. So when you first launch test, if you're a brand new user, you're going to be asked which profile you identify yourself with, and you can see the options here, either automation engineer or developer, and you can change this whenever you want through the preferences. And all this defines is the the type of scenario that you can create. So as a developer, which I am right now, I can I'll go ahead and create a new one. And so when I create a new scenario, I can choose which option I want to use. Once you save it, we currently have it so that you can't switch it because there are some API, or not necessarily API differences, but the things that you can do within a WebDriver test are different than what you can do in an in-browser test, just because of the way the communication occurs between Sencha Test and the browser, and then Sencha Test to WebDriver to the target browser that WebDriver is connecting to. Yeah?
Does Sencha Test support running unit tests in parallel?
Yeah.
And do you have to specify that, or does it automatically detect it, depending on the test?
So if you, per test, it doesn't do it per test. So I'll show you an example real quick. Let's see here. I'll do my unit test. So for example, I can do Firefox and Chrome at the same time. So let me clean this up a second. Okay. And I'll just run this email real quick. So I can run both of them in parallel. And then on the STC side, I'll just show real quick. When you're creating the browser farm that you want to run, you can specify all the browsers that you want to run. And then when you choose to run that pool of browsers from STC, it'll run all of them.
So if I wanted to test multiple models, for example, I don't necessarily need a browser for that. Would it know that it can run those model tests in parallel?
Oh, I see what you're saying. It'll run them in order. Sorry. I thought you meant parallel in browsers.
Oh no, just because across the board. Because I know, from what I understand, Sencha Test can do unit tests around models, stores, controllers,
Sure.
et cetera, et cetera. I figured more of the back-end components, Sencha Test could take advantage of like multi-core processors and things like that.
I got you. Yeah, currently that's not there. They would just run it, in order. That's actually a good, something to consider for sure. Yes, sir.
Can you open a functional test for login?
Yeah.
So you have two types and a submit. So how do you make sure the submit happens after both fields have been filled?
That's the beauty, thank you. That's the beauty of the Futures API. The asynchronicity that we talked about, which is a headache for everyone to deal with, the Futures API takes care of that for you. So these are written synchronously. All of that stuff obviously in the background is happening asynchronously because we don't necessarily know that that username field is visible yet. Maybe it's being rendered by some other process. But the Futures API is built in such a way that it's going to wait until that thing is visible and ready for whatever action is going to occur on it. And so each of these steps, get username, type, get password, type, and then locating the login button, and then actually clicking on it, they're going to happen in a prescribed order. And if one of these is missing or fails, it won't get to the submit button. So the Futures API it's kind of like a magic curtain that just don't look at the man behind the curtain. It's just going to work. Yeah.
Does Sencha Test support mocks and stubs?
Currently we don't have anything built in to support those, but there are strategies that you can use to do that. Max talked about some of those yesterday at the training, so we can catch up with you afterwards to kind of talk through some of those strategies if you'd like. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much for coming out today. Hope you're excited about the stuff that's coming in Sencha Test 2.0. Please check out the EA. Please get on the forums too if you have suggestions for new features, if you find issues that you're struggling with or want questions answered, we'd love to connect with you there. And of course, myself, Subu, Craig Comstock, Nick Rogers, and Marcelo are going to be around SenchaCon the next several days. So please come and track us down if you have questions. have ideas or just want to chat about Sencha Test, we'd love to talk with you.
Yeah, and to add to that, we have like four or five more great sessions on the test track. One's given by Profik, who are one of our partners, and who are very actively involved in validating the Sencha Test product. They are going to talk about how to test modern Next.js apps using Sencha Test. And there's one session by Craig Comstock who would go deep dive into the Futures API, and he has promised no demo, no presentation. Same with Marcelo. He has a session about tying everything into CI, writing tests, and he has a lot of secret things that he wants to show. He wouldn't tell me. So go to those sessions. You can learn more about how well you can use Sencha Test for not just unit testing or functional testing and beyond that. And he also promised no presentation. So that's all the presentation you guys are going to see.
We're out of time. Please be sure to fill out the survey on your app. We'd love to hear your feedback of how you enjoyed the session. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.